Over 800,000 Americans have a heart attack every year. 1 in 5 happens silently. No chest pain, no warning. After 45, your odds double. And your cholesterol test can read perfectly normal. So how do you check if you're at risk? Here's the part that should stop you. There's a way to find out, and it comes down to a single number that most standard lab panels skip right past. Stay with me, because in a few minutes I'm going to show you exactly what it is, why it starts working against you after 45, and how to ask your own physician for it by name. I'm Sophia Hart. I spend my days deep in cardiology research, pulling apart the studies most people never see, and translating them into something you can use for your own body. So let's talk about why this matters to you, specifically. Maybe you know the feeling. You go in for your yearly checkup, they run the usual blood work, the doctor glances at the page and says everything looks fine. You walk out relieved. And still, somewhere in the back of your mind, there's a question you can't quite shake, because you've seen what happens to people who were also told they were fine. You probably know one of them. Someone who seemed perfectly healthy, kept up with their checkups, right up until the morning everything changed. And afterward, the first thing everyone said was the same. There was no sign. Nobody saw it coming. So let me be clear. If that worry lives in you, it is not paranoia, and it is not a failure of willpower. Your body is fully capable of carrying a serious problem without handing you one obvious signal. That's not a character flaw. It's biology doing exactly what it evolved to do, keeping you upright and functional, even while something underneath is quietly going wrong. And that leads us straight to the part almost no one talks about. We tend to assume that if a heart attack didn't drop you where you stood, it couldn't have been the real thing. The evidence says the opposite. Researchers in Iceland followed more than 900 older adults for over a decade, scanning their hearts for damage they had no idea was there, work published in the journal JAMA Cardiology. And what they found should permanently retire the word minor. By the 10-year mark, the people walking around with an attack they never felt were dying at the same rate as those whose heart attack had been caught and treated in a hospital. Sit with that for a second. Same outcome. The only real difference was that one group got a warning and a plan, and the other got nothing at all, because no one knew there was anything to treat. So here's the obvious question. If this is so dangerous, why doesn't the standard checkup catch it? You'd assume the cholesterol panel, the test built to flag heart trouble, would light up like a dashboard warning. For a huge number of people, it simply doesn't. You can sit across from your doctor with numbers that look textbook normal, while the actual process behind one of these events is already underway inside you. That's the uncomfortable gap at the center of this story. Normal cholesterol and low risk are not the same statement, and treating them as if they are is exactly how careful, responsible people get caught off guard. Think of it like a fuel gauge reading full while the tank is slowly leaking out the bottom. The needle looks reassuring. It's just measuring the wrong thing. And by the time the engine sputters, the trouble has been building for years, which is exactly why that one overlooked number matters so much, and why it drifts in the wrong direction right as most of us cross into our late 40s. In the next few minutes, I'll take you inside your own bloodstream and show you what's actually driving this, in plain language, with the research underneath it. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you'll never read a lab report the same way again. So let's go inside, because once you see how one of these events actually happens, everything else clicks into place. A heart attack almost never comes out of nowhere. For years, sometimes decades, tiny fatty particles drift through your bloodstream, and some of them slip into the wall of an artery and get stuck. They pile up, the body tries to wall them off, and that patch slowly grows into a deposit that narrows and stiffens the artery. One day a piece of it tears open, a clot forms on top, the flow stops, and that's the event. Here's the piece almost everyone misses. What decides how fast that deposit grows isn't really how much cholesterol is floating around. It's how many of those particles there are, how many individual trucks are out on the road looking for a wall to crash into. And it turns out we can count them almost exactly, because every single one of these harmful particles carries one specific protein stamped on its surface. It's called apolipoprotein B, ApoB for short. One particle, one tag. So when you measure that protein, you're not guessing. You're taking a direct head count of the particles that do the damage. And that is the one measurement your standard panel almost never includes. So why doesn't the usual cholesterol result tell you this? Because it's answering a different question. Your standard reading measures the total cargo, how much cholesterol is packed inside all those particles combined. The particle count tells you how many vehicles are carrying it. And those two numbers can fall completely out of step. Picture two delivery fleets hauling the exact same total weight. One does it with a handful of big, full trucks. The other uses 3 times as many small, half-empty ones. Same cargo on paper, but the second fleet has far more vehicles pulling up to your artery walls, far more chances for one to break through. On a lab report, those two people look identical. In their arteries, they're not remotely the same. And before you assume this only applies to people who already look unhealthy, it doesn't. Researchers at UT Southwestern went through the blood work of more than 12,000 American adults and found that this mismatch, a normal-looking cholesterol number sitting on top of a high particle count, shows up even in people with no obvious risk factors at all. People who look after themselves and would pass every item on the standard checklist. For them, that reassuring result isn't reassurance, it's a blind spot. And this is not a fringe idea. One of the largest investigations of its kind, published in the European Heart Journal, followed nearly 300,000 adults for more than a decade and landed on a blunt conclusion. The cholesterol number, on its own, is simply not a reliable stand-in for the particle count. When the two disagree, it's the particles, not the cholesterol, that match up with who actually goes on to have a heart attack. So that wave of relief you felt walking out of your last checkup? It may have rested on the wrong measurement entirely. Not because anyone misled you, but because the test that got run was never built to count the thing that matters most. And here's what turns this from interesting into urgent. That particle count is not some fixed trait you're stuck with for life. It moves. And for most of us, it starts moving in exactly the wrong direction right around the mid-40s, quietly, steadily, for reasons written into the way the body ages. What those reasons are, and why they hit men and women on completely different timelines, is where this gets personal. That's next. So here's the timeline nobody hands you at your checkup. Your risk of a serious cardiac event doesn't rise in a gentle straight line. Decades of population data show it roughly doubles with each 10 years you age past 40. And that particle count we just talked about is one of the biggest reasons why. But how it climbs splits sharply depending on whether you're a woman or a man. Same destination, 2 different roads. Let's take them one at a time. If you're a woman, your body has been quietly protecting you since your 20s. Estrogen acts like a bodyguard for your arteries, keeping the vessel walls flexible and holding your lipids in a friendlier shape. Then, somewhere in your mid-40s, that bodyguard starts clocking out. As estrogen withdraws through the years around your final period, artery walls stiffen, deep fat starts packing in around your organs, and your blood begins to favor exactly those small, dense, plentiful particles we've been tracking. And here's the part that ties back to everything. Much of this happens while your total cholesterol barely moves. The standard number holds steady. The risk underneath it does not. That's the verdict of a major scientific statement from the American Heart Association, built on one of the longest-running studies of women's health ever conducted. Thousands of women followed straight through this transition. One of its starkest findings? In roughly the 2 years around the final period, the rate at which a woman lays down that dangerous deep fat can double. Not over a lifetime, in about 2 years. Quick aside before we cross to the other half of the room. If this is already changing how you think about that normal lab result, consider subscribing. It's the simplest way to tell me this kind of plain, evidence-first breakdown is worth making, and it helps these explanations reach people who'd never otherwise find them. Okay, back to it. If you're a man, you don't get one dramatic turning point. Your curve has been climbing earlier and more steadily all along. On average, men run a full decade ahead of women on the cardiovascular timeline. What shifts in your 40s is the engine. Testosterone begins a slow decline, and that decline invites more deep abdominal fat, which would be bad enough, except it's a loop. Less testosterone encourages more of that fat. More of that fat pushes testosterone lower still. The multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, a large American investigation spanning several backgrounds documented exactly that link between rising deep fat and falling testosterone in men. And here's why that loop matters. Deep abdominal fat isn't a passive storage bin, it's metabolically loud. It disrupts how your body handles blood sugar, and in doing so, it pushes your system to mint more of those small, numerous particles that crash into artery walls. So once again, the particle count climbs while the cholesterol number on your report sits there looking perfectly respectable. So look at where this leaves both of you. A woman losing her estrogen shield, a man caught in a fat and hormone loop, two different stories arriving at the very same place. After the mid-40s, your body quietly starts manufacturing more of the exact particles that drive heart disease, and it does it in the way your standard checkup is least equipped to catch. That's what doubles after 45 really means underneath the headline. Not a curse, a mechanism. Which lands us on the only question that matters now. If the test almost everyone relies on can miss all of this, what should you be measuring instead? And what does the research say actually predicts whether you're heading for trouble? That's exactly where we're going next. So if the standard cholesterol number can miss all of this, what should you be asking for instead? Here's the genuinely good news. The research is not vague about it, and the tools already exist. Most people have simply never been offered them. There are 3 measurements that actually track the danger we've been describing, and you can walk into your next appointment knowing all 3 by name. The first is the one we've already met, the particle count, measured by a simple blood test for ApoB. Remember, this counts the individual particles capable of lodging in an artery wall, the thing that actually drives the damage, instead of just weighing their contents. It's a single, inexpensive blood draw, and major cardiology guidelines, especially in Europe, have recommended it for years. In much of American practice, it still isn't run by default, so the move is simple. Ask whether it belongs on your next panel. The second is one almost no one has heard of, and it may be the most important name in this entire video. It's called lipoprotein A, LPA for short. Think of it as a stickier, more inflammatory cousin of ordinary cholesterol. And here's what sets it apart. Your level is written into your genes. You inherited it. It barely shifts across your whole life, so you usually only need to measure it once. According to the American Heart Association, roughly 1 in 5 people are walking around with a high level, and it independently raises the odds of both a heart attack and a stroke. Now connect that to everything we've covered. Your standard cholesterol can read flawless while this inherited number quietly stacks the deck against you. And it's almost never on a routine panel. There's no simple pill to lower it yet, so the value of knowing is this. If yours is high, you and your doctor take every other risk far more seriously, far earlier. The third one does something the others can't. Everything so far has been a forecast, a way of estimating the odds. This turns the forecast into a photograph. It's called a coronary calcium scan, a quick, painless CT image that counts the hardened plaque already sitting in the arteries of your heart. A high number is an early, undeniable wake-up call, years before you'd feel a thing. And a 0 is among the most reassuring results in all of cardiology. In one study of more than 40,000 adults, the people who scored a true 0 had a yearly death rate of well under 1 in 1,000. It's generally aimed at people between 40 and 70 with no symptoms, which, if you're listening to this, may be exactly you. And that's the part I want you to hold on to. None of these is experimental or hard to find. They're sitting in the medical literature and, in most cases, in the lab down the road. The thing standing between you and a real answer usually isn't the science. It's that no one thought to order it. So the most powerful move available to you is almost embarrassingly simple. Bring these 3 up at your next visit, by name, and turn your checkup into a real conversation about your heart. But knowing your numbers is only step 1. The question everyone asks next is the right one. Once you can finally see the real picture, what actually moves it? What does the evidence say you can start doing today to push that particle count down and pull your risk back the other way? That's where we're headed. So you've seen the real picture. Now, what actually moves it? Here's the genuinely hopeful part. Of all the numbers we've discussed, the particle count is one of the most responsive in your entire body. Unlike the inherited one you can't change, This one answers, sometimes within weeks, to the choices you make. You are not a passenger here. So let's walk through the levers the research says actually work, and why. The first is almost laughably underrated: the soft, soluble fiber in foods like oats, beans, lentils, apples, and barley. Think of it as a sponge moving through your gut. It soaks up the very raw material your liver would otherwise use to build more of those particles and carries it out of the body. And this is not a folk remedy. A pooled analysis of more than 180 clinical trials, over 14,000 people, found that simply getting more soluble fiber measurably lowered the particle count itself, not the vague cholesterol number, the thing that actually drives the plaque. The second lever is the kind of fat on your plate. And the science here is widely misunderstood, so listen closely. It's less about how much fat you eat than which kind. When you shift away from heavy saturated fat and toward the unsaturated fats in olive oil, nuts, avocado, and fish, your liver tends to release fewer of those particles into your blood. And when the strongest trials were pooled for the American Heart Association, that single swap was tied to cutting heart disease risk by close to a third. One category of fat. The third lever takes us straight back to that deep belly fat. Two things shrink it and quiet the system that mints small, dense particles. One is pulling back on refined sugar and heavily processed carbs, the fuel behind that fat and the blood sugar swings that drive it. The other is movement. And this is the one I'd put on a billboard if I could. Regular activity, a brisk walk most days, plus a little resistance work to hold on to your muscle, burns visceral fat directly and sharpens how your body handles blood sugar. You're turning down the factory at its source. Two more, fast, because they're too powerful to skip. Protect your sleep. Short, broken nights quietly worsen everything we've described. And if you smoke, this is the highest value change available to you. Full stop. Nothing else on this list undoes as much damage. Now, a piece of honesty. For some people, especially anyone carrying that inherited risk, a high particle count or a calcium score that lit up, lifestyle is the foundation, but not always the whole answer. That isn't a failure on your part, it's biology, and it's exactly what modern medicine is built for. The move there isn't to push harder on your own, it's to bring these numbers to your doctor and build a real plan together. And please hear this clearly. None of this is about perfection or punishment or earning your food. It's a handful of consistent, unglamorous shifts that, stacked over months, can genuinely bend that curve back in your favor. So, before we finish, let me pull all of it into the one thing I most want you to carry out of here, and the single first step worth taking this week. So let's bring this all the way back around. You started this video with a quietly unsettling possibility that you could feel completely fine, sail through your annual checkup with a gold star, and still be carrying real, building danger you'd never sense. That isn't fear-mongering. It's simply the gap between what the standard test measures and what actually drives a heart attack. And now you understand that gap better than most people ever will. Look at the whole shape of it. The damage is driven less by how much cholesterol you carry than by how many particles are out there delivering it. That count tends to climb quietly after the mid-40s as a woman loses her estrogen shield, as a man settles into that fat and hormone loop. And it can rise while your familiar cholesterol number sits there looking perfectly fine. This is exactly why the danger so often arrives without a single warning. The process is silent by design, and the one test most people lean on was never built to hear it. For a lot of people, that's where the story ends, blindsided years later. But it doesn't have to be yours, because none of this is invisible anymore. 3 numbers bring it into the light, and a handful of ordinary, repeatable habits bend it back the other way. So if you remember nothing else from the last 20 minutes, remember this. The most powerful move you can make is to refuse to settle for half a picture, and to do it now, while you still feel fine, because feeling fine was never proof of anything. You don't need to overhaul your life today. You need one small action. Take the names of those 3 numbers, the particle count, the inherited one, and the calcium scan. Write them down and bring them to your next appointment. That single conversation can surface in one afternoon what a routine checkup has been quietly missing for years. Remember the question I opened with? How do you know if you're one of the people genuinely at risk? Here's what's changed in the time we've spent together. You're no longer guessing, and you're no longer waiting to find out the hard way. You know exactly what to ask for, why it matters, and what moves it. That is the entire difference between being ambushed by your own body and staying a step ahead of it. The fear you might have felt at the start was never the enemy. The not knowing was. And you just fixed that. If this finally pulled the whole picture into focus, consider subscribing. A new evidence-first breakdown like this one lands every week, and it's the simplest way to keep these explanations reaching the people who need them. And do me one favor. Tell me in the comments which of these 3 numbers you had never heard of before today. I read every single one. This has been Sophia Hart, and I'll see you in the next one.